Good evening, everybody. A very, very warm welcome to you all this evening to Shute Festival event. My name is Sophie Ibbotson. I'm a development consultant and travel writer focusing on Central Asia, and I'm also Uzbekistan's ambassador for tourism. I'm here this evening with travel and food writer Caroline Eden to discuss her latest award-winning book, Red Sands. Caroline has written extensively about Central Asia, reflecting her many years of travel within the region. She's a recipient of the Golden Pen Award, which is given by Uzbekistan to a foreign journalist who has written the best articles about the country, largely in recognition of her previous book, Samarkand. One of the things that really excites me about Caroline is the way that she has been able to bring Central Asia, which many people consider to be quite a niche interest, to mainstream audiences, whether she's writing about Winter Melons in the Financial Times or the Fergana Valley in the Sunday Times. And it's great that she's able to join us this evening to give us a little more insight into Central Asia, the places and the people that she's had the opportunity to meet, many of whom are featured in Red Sands. Caroline, the first thing I wanted to ask you about this evening was what it is that made you first interested in Central Asia.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Sophie. There's some slightly odd feedback that I can hear. Sorry, everybody. I'm just going to maybe wait to see if we can fix that. What do you think, Sophie? I can't quite tell where it's coming from. Most bizarre.
I'm going to see if I can mute. Is that better?
It seems to be.
No.
Yes, the feedback is intense, I agree. It's very odd.
I'm going to see if I can mute my microphone and see if that makes a difference while you're speaking, and then I'll unmute myself when I speak.
I'll do the same. Very odd. Okay, Sophie's muted. Yeah, it's very disrupting. Really sure what to suggest. I haven't done the crowdcast before. I'm not sure this is workable as is.
Caroline, have you got earbuds you can wear?
Literally
headphones.
I do have some.
Try that. Try getting headphones. Yeah. And Sophie, have you got headphones by any chance?
I've never had this before. I'm going to put headphones in.
Okay. How's that? Can't hear you, Sophie. I think you're muted.
The sound problem is fixed, so if you keep your headphones plugged in, I think we're all...
I'm actually echoing.
Yeah, it's light echo.
Let's try a different Wi-Fi.
Caroline, if you turn your volume down a bit.
Yeah, I've turned the volume right down.
Okay.
How's that, everybody? I'm so sorry.
And yeah, hold back a bit. Yeah, not so close to the computer. Okay. And Sophie, have you got headphones?
I haven't. Well, I've got them here, but I didn't plug them in because it stopped as soon as Caroline says it.
I'd plug yours in as well, and I think that will help. Yeah.
Strangely, Sophie, you're not echoing, but I am.
You're okay, Caroline. You're not echoing, I think, for us, though.
Right. I'm so sorry, everybody. This is quite a strange scenario.
Can you still hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, it seems to have stopped the audience, so I think we're okay.
Right.
Right.
Sorry for that interlude.
I'm also just going to
Caroline,
switch
what
Wi-Fi in
to
case
Central
it's some
Asia?
connection. I'm in the centre of Edinburgh, but we never know. Very strange. Okay, I'm just going to talk. I'm repeating to myself, but as long as I'm not repeating to anybody else, that doesn't really matter. Is that okay, everybody? Okay, good to go. Thank you, Sophie, for that lovely introduction. I have been writing about Central Asia since about 2009. I became interested in the region because I was working for a guidebook company called
I'm just going to take these out. Hold that. I can hear everything I'm saying back to myself. It's really disorientating.
who are based in Hong Kong and had published a series of guidebooks all about Central Asia. One big £900 book on 900-page book on Tajikistan, and I really wanted to go and see these countries for myself. So I set off on a solo journey. Can you still hear me if I take these out?
Yes.
It's easier for me because then I'm not hearing myself coming back. And went to Uzbekistan and went to Tajikistan and completely fell in love with the region. I had a little travel story published in the Times, and that was really my first ever travel article. So ever since, I've been pitching articles and book reviews and writing about art and everything to do with Central Asia, which has completely captivated me. I'd spent a long time in India and really loved the Mughal architecture and really wanted to see where it had come from. So that was why I set off initially for Central Asia. And it's such an addictive region. Once you go to one country, you want to see the other four. And so that was where it started.
One of the things that fascinated me about the book, Red Sands, is that it's a fantastic introduction to the region for somebody who's never had the opportunity to visit. But equally for somebody like me who has been many times, I was still able to flick through, and every few pages I would be seeing something completely different, either a place I hadn't been or an idea I hadn't thought of or a new piece of history. And that was very, very exciting, and I think is one of the reasons that the book is so appealing. In our discussion this afternoon, I'm going to sort of hop around a little bit within the book and pull out some of the things that I think are most fabulous and things perhaps that people wouldn't have thought about previously. These are themes, places, people, and I want to start with talking to you about the relationship between food and landscape, because yes, this is a food book officially, but when you start reading it, actually there's a very, very strong sense of place, and food is a thread that runs through it, but it is very much a travel book and a geography book and a people geography book as well.
Yes. I completely agree. My idea was really, it's a bit of a Trojan horse, the book. I wanted to write an accessible book on Central Asia. It's actually quite hard to do this. There are great academic books on the market. The travel writing, the traditional travel writing tends to be quite male and quite gung-ho. And I wanted to use food as a way of talking about all the different things which interest me in the region. So food and landscape is a key thread through the book. And I suppose the place to start is where the book begins, in Western Kazakhstan, out by the Caspian Sea. And we travel inland to a place called Beka Ata, which is named after a Sufi clairvoyant born in 1750, who pilgrims go and visit the burial place and an underground mosque where he is. It's a 5-hour journey through the most mind-blowing landscape, the most remote, really most remote place I've ever been to. Huge towering sandy cliffs, trails of caravans of camels, extremely remote, sort of dirt roads, some asphalt. And the reason I wanted to go there, the link with food, is because the pilgrims visit, and obviously they need to eat. They've traveled an extremely long time to get there. So there are mosque kitchens that have been set up literally in the middle of nowhere, where cooks provide food and the pilgrims take donations to give the cooks to make. And I just thought this is so interesting. How does a kitchen function in such a remote place, and what's it like? So
Sam, do you have a photo to show us that demonstrates the landscapes?
Sorry, is everything okay, Sophie?
Yes, I was just asking Sam to show us the photograph to match.
I'm terrified about the sound now. Right, so these people are headed to Bekaa Atta. Before Islam came into Central Asia in the 7th and 8th centuries, slowly, people followed shamanism and animistic traditions. So this sort of harks back to then, where people worship the sky and the land and these sort of Sufi clairvoyants, one of which is Bekaa Atta. It was very, very interesting to see the kitchens. I happened to be there on a weekend when as many as 1,500 Kazakhs could be there to make the pilgrimage, many overnight. If it's a weekend, the cooks make plov for 1,500 people. Rich people maybe will take live animals to be slaughtered. There's a slaughterhouse on site. There's also an overnight space where you can sleep over. And the cooks were preparing the plov. They explained to me that if it's a quieter day, say it's a Wednesday, they make besh barmak for about 400 people. Besh barmak is meat and noodles, basically. And it was just incredible to see it. I actually didn't manage to get into the tomb itself because the queues were so ginormous. And I'd already been to another one a couple of hours previous called Shokon Atta, which you have to visit before you go to Bekaa Atta, and I'd managed to go into the underground mosque there and had seen the whole process of people praying and the imam reading the Quran, and we'd had tea and bread, and because it's such a long journey, and we did it on one day, Yuri and I, the driver, I couldn't wait. We had to drive back before nightfall. The roads are quite dicey. The camels just wander out. So that is a sort of extreme example of food in the landscape in Central Asia. And if I've got time, I'll talk briefly about another couple.
Please, go ahead.
The Kizzlecon Desert, the book takes its name from that. Red Sands, Kizzlecon, that's the name of a desert which spans Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And there, I found a remarkable cafe about 5 years ago. Lots of people stop there. It's not out of the ordinary like Bekaa Atta. It's a place where tourists stop. And I had shashlik and non bread, the round discs of bread which are cooked in the tandoor, and a melon and some tea. And I had a bit of a moment because I thought this is the most incredible thing when you think about it, because there's no waste, which everybody thinks about nowadays. These things are, it's such basic food, but it's completely it wouldn't really happen anywhere else apart from Central Asia. This particular meal, the shashlik was there being turned, the bread was being baked fresh, it was delicious. The melons are the best in the world, and it was so Central Asian. It was such a Central Asian moment, and I thought that's really an incredible lunch, as simple as it was.
You've written quite a lot about the winter melons, and whenever you speak to the Uzbek diaspora and ask them what they miss most, it is always the melons.
Mm.
Why do you think that is, other than the fact that they just taste absolutely fabulous?
The melons. So I was thinking about melons a lot a couple of years ago, and I wrote this article for the Financial Times, which was a dream commission for me, really. I happened to be in Central Asia. I said in the article that France is the land of the croissant, Uzbekistan is the land of the melon. And this is entirely true. Uzbekistan has a completely continental climate, which really suits melon growing. Uzbek varieties have been grown in California, which is similar, warmer sort of climate, but they're quite hard to grow elsewhere. A couple of particular variants have taken off in California. 160 varieties, 500,000 tons a year Uzbekistan produces. These were melons that once were sent to Russian tsars, to Chinese emperors as gifts. And what's really interesting about them is that they're buried in these melon sheds in the winter melons, which are harvested in September. They spend about 8 months maturing in a melon shed, often out in Kokand, where there's a lot of wind. And when they mature, they sort of gain maximum sucrose. They become very, very, very sweet, these winter melons. These are the most phenomenal melons. I've tried some just on the road in Jizak between Samarkand and Tashkent on the main road. The men camp out there at night to sell their melons to passing trade. They've got little beds set up as canopies so they can stay as wide awake as a broker from Bukhara, as the saying goes. And you can stop there and you can buy these melons and try them. And they're just amazing. They're completely sweet. Nothing comes close, the melons that we have here in the UK. They're completely and utterly different. And Uzbeks are, if they know about melons, they're very passionate about them. They have fantastical names like golden eyebrow and wolf's head and old lady melon. And sorry, I could go on about melons forever. And I think there was a saying, something like, he dropped the melon. Like if you mess something up, the saying in Uzbek is, oh, you dropped the melon, which I love.
One of the characters that I came across for the first time in Red Sands is Ella Christie, a female traveller who explored Uzbekistan in the early 20th century. I've had a long interest in Central Asia and read a lot of the travel writing in the region, but this was the first time that I had come across her. And I was wondering how you came across her and what you think of her writing and whether what she says about the region is still relevant today.
I can't remember how I first came across Ella Christie. But now that I know her, I'm quite obsessed with her, mainly because not many people know who she is. She took this photograph with a Kodak camera. She was traveling in the region in 1910 and 1912. I live in Edinburgh. She was born just outside Edinburgh, so there's that connection. And I think she was born in 1861. And she lived in Cowden Castle. She was born into a very wealthy family and had an absolute curiosity for the world and travelled a lot to countries like Japan and China as well, but went to Central Asia twice, 1910 and 1912. This picture is a picture of a picture because I met her grandnephew, Robert Christie, and he has boxes of her photographs that she took. Some of the Registan in Samarkand. She took pictures of Turkmen tribes. She travelled on the Oxus on a steamer. What I liked about her is that she's so different to male travel writers. If you read Fitzroy MacLean or Peter Hopkirk, she was very interested in the ordinary, not the ordinary, but the everyday, the domestic. So you can see, I think that's either shashlik or rice, something is cooking there. She talked about ovens a lot and the way people would prepare food. She had no ambitions to break records or traverse mountain ranges. She just wanted to see how life was. And I've got a quote here. She said, my reasons for making the journey were twofold. First, the extreme desire to see for myself what lay on that comparatively bare spot on the map east of the Caspian Sea. And secondly, the lure of those magic names, Bukhara and Samarkand, which I think we can all understand. They evoke the region, those names. Fittingly, when she set off, there was an outbreak of smallpox and plague, and the Foreign Office had warned her about going. She was determined and went anyway. And they said to her, should you become infected with one of these terrible diseases, what you need to do is hang a red rag outside your window, stay inside. That way people know you're infected. And she said, you know, there probably aren't going to be any windows for me to hang it, and where will I find the red cloth anyway? She was completely determined to go. Robert Christie, her great-grandnephew, said to me that she was very generous, a nice woman, did not like social chit-chat or nonsense. And once she was at Dollar Railway Station, which is a tiny railway station in, I think, Clackmannanshire, and she was all packed up and ready to go. And this chap on the platform turned to her and said, "Oh, are you off to Edinburgh?" She snapped back and went, "No, I'm going to Samarkand." And off she went. She was an amazing woman. She writes about cooking eggs on spirit lamps in the desert and her absolute fear of the karakut spider, which could kill a camel in 3 hours. And she writes about how she saw the sands blowing on the River Oxus, on the Oxus River, and how it reminded her of Scotch mist. So that's Ella Christie, quite a remarkable woman.
The descriptions, I mean, it sounds like her descriptions of domestic life in Uzbekistan gave insight to the country and its culture hundreds or so years ago. again, that's something that comes through very much with Red Sands. There are a lot of very evocative descriptions of everyday places, everyday situations, but through them we learn an awful lot about what drives the countries, in Uzbekistan in particular. And I'm thinking here specifically about the bazaars, and particularly the bazaar in Tashkent, which really is the commercial centre of the city. And if you want to see what's going on in Uzbekistan, politically, economically, socially, start in the bazaar.
Couldn't agree more. You catch an immediate feel for a place in the bazaar. What you can see there in that photo, lovely photo taken by Theodore Kay, who shot the location photography in Red Sands on my previous book, Black Sea, is Korean salads made by the Koryo Saram, the Korean people who were exiled by Stalin. Many stayed on, and one of the remnants of coming to Central Asia are these incredibly spicy salads, which everybody loves. The carrot ones are particularly popular. You can see these big piles of carrot salads. Should I talk a little bit about the Central Asian pantry, which is something?
I think that would be ideal, and particularly with the Korean influence is a fascinating one, because people don't expect to find Korean food in Uzbekistan. And yet, because of the particularly Soviet history of the country, there is an unexpected cosmopolitanism, which has influenced all aspects of contemporary culture, but particularly the food scene.
I think it's completely right. It is multicultural, much more than I think immediately meets the eye. Traditional Russian flavors are there in abundance. A lot of dill, kefir, which is completely delicious. You know, the sort of the milk style drink, smetana, the sour cream. Also, more sort of traditionally Uzbek flavors. So you would need to serve your plov or shashlik, certainly pickled pink onions, and very good cumin. The cumin that we tend to buy here is not as punchy as the cumin in Uzbekistan. And then there's the rice, which I was just talking to somebody about this afternoon. Someone was asking, what type of rice should one make plov with, the famous rice dish that everybody eats in Central Asia. And I've written recipes for the Western market with basmati rice. This is completely controversial, really, because the rice that you eat with plov in Central Asia is nothing like basmati rice. But basmati rice is good because the grains stay separate. Risotto rice, it becomes too dense and too sort of clogged up. Uzgen rice is a fantastic rice in Central Asia. Fat, reddish. It's got a depth to it which suits the sort of oiliness of a plov. Plov, for people that perhaps don't know, is a layered rice dish which has a lot of fables and honorary things attached to it. It's cooked in a giant kazan, often outside, traditionally by men, not so much anymore. The oil is critical, the starting point. Oil, onions, carrots. This is zervak. I think it's the correct term, Sophie. Zervak is the sort of basis of the plov. This has to be very good. And then you're layering the rice, and you're having beef, mutton, lamb on the top, maybe some barberries, maybe some quail's eggs. It's very, very, very calorific. The Uzbeks are the masters of plov, but I've eaten very good plovs in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan as well. So yeah, I mean, in the markets you're looking at pumpkins, a lot of melons, fantastic loaves of bread, cabbages, which are obviously a very sort of Russian flavour traditionally. Sesame seeds, onion seeds are used, but I think people are always they expect it to be, they're like, where's the Asian street food? It's like, well, Central Asia's not really about Asian street food. Shashlik is your thing which is cooked on the side of the road, and then it's samsa, the little pastry turnovers, look a bit like samosas, delicious, filled with lamb or pumpkin or potato. This is your sort of snack food, but it's not a place of very hot flavors, and it's not a place where you pull up one of those tiny plastic stalls and eat a fantastically spicy soup. That's not the case.
If you were having a conversation with a culinary novice who wanted a first attempt at making some sort of Central Asian food at home, what dish would you recommend they start with? Should they go straight for the plov, or is there something else which is a gateway food to Central Asian cuisine?
I'm thinking about Ashland food, but I'm thinking that's too much of a leap. I think Samsa actually is a great place to start. I mean, even a child could make Samsa. Ready-made pastry, off you go. You do the filling, you can do it in a food processor, you just put it into a triangle and bake it. I mean, we had some fun recently with our Central Asian bake-off, and I think Samsa really is a very easy thing that most people can make.
It's also absolutely delicious.
It's
so
incredibly
an advantage as well.
I'm just trying to find a picture so people can see what it looks like. Right, there's a picture. If I just hold that up. So really, it's as simple as it gets.
So it's a pastry parcel similar to an Indian samosa, filled with either meat or vegetables.
Yeah.
One of the sort of historic figures who comes up in the book on a number of occasions is Tamerlane, or Amir Timur, who was, or is today, the national hero of Uzbekistan, but was historically somewhat more contentious, hero or villain, depending on how you think about him. And most people who are aware of Amir Timur and his legacy know about his military exploits, the extent of his empire, and the huge buildings, monumental architecture that he constructed in Samarkand and in Shukri-Subs, two of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Uzbekistan. Something that I didn't know anything about before reading Red Sands was his feasting. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that, because that's, for me, fascinating to think what somebody might have had on their dining table 600 years ago.
It is amazing. And I wish more had been written about it. We've got some very good accounts written by envoys who were visiting Tamerlane in his tented gardens. People tended to feast outside in tented gardens. He had several tented gardens in Samarkand, the traces of which don't remain today, which I think is a great shame. On one night, there'd be enough food for a year. So if Tamerlane Timur was entertaining, it would be extremely meat heavy. One of the nicest images which I found was that his cooks would load up leather serving platters with handles and curved smooth bottoms. And this is because there was so much food piled on it, they would literally drag it across the floor to him. And then stews would be served from basins. They're described as basins of stews. And there'd be ginormous goblets of sweetened mare's milk. These are not flavours that most of us would be comfortable with today. But he had access to fantastic spices from the Silk Road, expensive spices, nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon. So the story goes that people didn't go hungry in Samarkand when he was in charge. It was quite a wealthy city because of him. And his feasts were just famous. There's a lot of drinking. I think there's probably a fair amount of debauchery. And these would go on for days, these parties, these feasts that Tamerlane would host. And he's such an interesting character because, yes, he was barbaric, and I think he's quoted at having killed 17 million or something like that in his conquests, which I think stretched all the way to the Black Sea. But he was also a lover of knowledge and a great chessman. And I think double the number of chess pieces the story goes to try and make the game harder. He loved it so much, loved the challenge. He had good taste, but he was illiterate. He's a very, very interesting person.
You've mentioned briefly the wine and the debauchery. There are around Samarkand. Have you had an opportunity to visit the vineyards or to drink any of the wines produced in the region?
I actually haven't, which makes me feel terrible. I remember being in Bukhara and seeing signs for wine tasting, and I'm not a wine snob, but I haven't. Georgia obviously is another story, somewhere else that Sophie and I both love, but I haven't tried the wines. I was very interested that when I was in Rishton and Margalan in the Fergana Valley, there were tunnels and tunnels and tunnels of grapes, which traditionally would have been turned into raisins, but also they produced an amazing grape vinegar. So it's a tradition that's always been there. But I'm yet to try the Uzbek wine.
I have seen there are a number of international grape varieties being grown for winemaking, including some of the Georgian grapes. So you can now find Saparavi wines with the Saparavi grapes, which is a Georgian variety grown in Uzbekistan and made into wine by by Uzbek winemakers, which is a interesting link back to the Caucasus.
Next time.
I can't promise you what the quality of the wine is like, but certainly an interesting story. Throughout your book, you really bring to life places through the people that you meet and the conversations that you have. And I think one of the strengths of spending a prolonged period in an area, and particularly if you have some language skills, is being able to build relationships with the people that you meet along the way. Is there anybody particular who made an impression of you? Any long friendships that you have established through your travels?
This leads me in nicely to talk about Imenjon Makhmudov in Osh. Here he is. An absolute legend and the best cooker of plov I've ever met. I met Imenjon 5 or 6 years ago, and I always stay with him when I'm in Osh. And he sits me down. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. The computer did some sort of update. He sits me down under his beautiful wooden canopy that he has. He's got a traditional courtyard house in a mahala in Osh. So he's Uzbek. Osh is 50%, Kyrgyz 50% Uzbek. And we have tea under his quails. He's got lovely bouncing wicker bird cages full of quails, and the eggs go into his plov. And he's wonderful. He's a grandfather. His family moved to Uzbekistan from across the border in Kyrgyzstan 20 generations ago. And his life story is so interesting. He worked as a cook for many years at the base camp of Peak Lenin, which is one of the 7,000 peaks close to the Tajik border, I think. I haven't been. And there he cooked for a lot of the leading Soviet mountaineers, men like Anatoly Bukharev, who was depicted in the 2015 epic film Everest. He was once described as a man, what was it, something like lungs with legs. I mean, he scaled an enormous amount of 7,000 and 8,000 meter peaks, and very sadly died on Christmas Day on Everest. And he would eat Imenjon's plov. So Imenjon has got great life stories, and sitting there and eating his plov and his famous mustard as well, which he makes, which he says really gets people up the mountains and back again safely. Just a real character and a wonderful man. I really hope he's okay. I've been trying to contact him during COVID and I haven't managed to get through. So I'll be going as soon as it's safe to see him and take him a copy of the book. But he's wonderful. He's the sort of person who you could just return to year after year and you'd get the same welcome. And a woman called Nazira, who's in the walnut forest in Kyrgyzstan, same story, formidable woman. I don't know what happened to her husband, but I've stayed with her a few times. She calls me Carolina. She makes these incredible kefir pancakes every morning. She's a big woman and lots of grandchildren. And she's just wonderful, incredibly hospitable, the Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan, as are the Kyrgyz. But the Uzbeks I have a particular soft spot for in the Fergana Valley. Quite traditional, but wonderful at welcoming guests and making you feel comfortable.
Do you think because you are a woman and particularly because you have an interest in food and food preparation and the whole sort of cooking experience, do you think you are given access more to the private spaces within people's homes? Is it that you see a different aspect of people's homes and lives?
Possibly. I mean, I am always very enthusiastic and very interested and very gentle and careful about how I approach people. And I think people know, if you're just passing through and you're sort of, on a bit of a mission to get to the next place, or if you are genuinely interested, And I think lots of people, you only have to show a little bit of interest and people just open up and want to tell you. And food is very good at showing people as people and not as issues. And the Fergana Valley has had so much bloodshed in the recent history that I think people there especially want to show you it's not like that. That the ethnic violence we've heard of between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz is not the case with ordinary people. There's all of that at play as well, but I think food's just a really good leveler generally, and it's very unthreatening, and we all do it 3 times a day, and we all have an interest, most of us, in it, and yeah, I think possibly the food does help.
Do you think that there is a restaurant culture and more of a public food culture developing in Central Asia? I mean, most of the best meals I've enjoyed, probably as with you, have been home cooked meals in people's sort of family compounds or courtyards. Is that growing? Is it developing? And as a tourist, are you going to be able to access more and more food, or is the best food always going to be at home?
In my experience, the best food is almost always in people's homes. And that was such a frustration with me many years ago when I wrote my first book, Samarkand. I only wrote that book. I never intended to write about food. I wrote that book because I was so fed up with guidebooks, not all guidebooks, some guidebooks, Lonely Planet, saying that the food's terrible in Central Asia and, you know, you're going to be hungry and you're going to get an upset stomach and it's just all a bit of a grind. And I was like, that's just not true. If you're in someone's home and they're producing 10 different salads and they've got home-baked bread and lovely tea and the best fruit in the world and lovely meat and rice, I mean, how can you say this? How can it be true that it's a terrible food? It's just not true. So you have to keep an open mind. I think with Central Asians, eating out is sort of something that people do, but I'm never sure they're enjoying it so much. I mean, they're enjoying it if they're sort of having a drink and socializing, but I think it's more about that than the food. I think the food is probably better at home. And I think people go to restaurants to celebrate a birthday, an anniversary, and that sort of thing. But I think, I mean, the elite in Tashkent have got some very nice restaurants available to them. The restaurants in Almaty are brilliant. But I think, I mean, it's such a huge region. Obviously, it depends which city you're in. Bishkek now has got amazing restaurants. Mm. So,
is that sort of underdevelopment of the restaurant scene, do you think, the reason that we see very few Central Asian restaurants abroad? I mean, in the UK, for example, we have a lot of Georgian restaurants, Turkish restaurants, Lebanese restaurants, but you'd have to search very hard to find a Kazakh restaurant or a Tajik restaurant or an Uzbek restaurant.
It's a shame. A couple have tried, haven't they? I'm thinking in Marylebone, and they've never quite worked. I think they need to modernise and maybe change some of the flavours for Western palate. People here are eating a little bit less meat nowadays, for example, and it is quite a meat-heavy cuisine. And that's what I try and do in my books is, you know, the samsa I was talking about earlier, there's a samsa in Tajikistan, and they're called sambusa there, that are completely vegetarian, and they're with chickpeas and mint and herbs, spring herbs. Completely delicious. Sounds like it wouldn't taste it very much, but it does with the buttery puff pastry. I think some adaptation. I'm not suggesting it would be me, but I think you need to take somebody in and say, maybe put some pomegranate molasses on the salad, or maybe don't put quite that much oil in the plov. You know, just tweaks. Nothing huge. You can still keep it authentic, but you know, I think it just needs maybe a bit more variety.
Mm. And perhaps your role, if I may suggest, is to translate the authentic recipes for a foreign audience and to showcase what the region can do, because there's also a lot of lack of visibility. People don't know what to expect from Central Asian food.
However, I'm just thinking, Sophie, of course, this isn't the case in New York, where there's a huge diaspora of Uzbeks. So you go to Rego Park and there's a lot of Uzbek restaurants. There aren't many Central Asian people living in the UK. Am I correct? I think I'm correct to say that.
It's hard to know. In fact, I asked the embassy about that today and they weren't sure either.
It is quite hard to know, but I know there aren't whole areas where you just get a string of You know, they've got things like Uzbek supermarkets in New York, which is amazing to me. That you could go and buy. It'd be like being buy the rice, buy the spices. We don't have that. So I think it's that too. I think it's the demographic issue as well.
I'm going to open the Q&A now, and we have a question from Janet Crompton, and she says, how did you become a travel writer, and what came first? Was it travel or was it food?
It was definitely travel. I have to admit, I didn't know an awful lot about food until about 5 or 6 years ago, and quite late to the game. I've always enjoyed food, but it was never really my focus. I was writing travel articles, so I was sort of interested in everything from art to landscape. I think as a travel writer, someone called it the red light district of literature. You pick and you sort of do a bit of everything, and it's sort of a bit, you know, it's got a bit of a funny reputation, travel writing. But food, I like food because it focuses you in, and then you can write about anything. Because food can be a million and one things. It can be agriculture, it can be landscape, it can be climate change, it can be the way people farm, it can be the way people eat in fancy restaurants. You know, life stories. I write about the gulags in Kazakhstan and their link to the dairy. It opens up whole worlds, but it kind of keeps you along a theme, and I like that. I sort of use food to talk about other things, and people are incredibly open-minded. Once you bring people in through food, you can talk about anything. So yeah, that's how it went.
Do you think that the fact that you are a foreigner writing about Central Asia gives you perhaps more space to talk about some of the controversial subjects, like the gulags, for example? Are you able and freer to write about them than perhaps some local writers might be?
I think definitely. So, and this is a source of frustration, obviously. I'd love to see more, Sophie and I were talking about this the other day, more writers being published from Central Asia. There are lots of good journalists who write for various online publications. These are countries not very good on the free press front, and the publishing houses aren't really there. But I think it will come eventually. I think it's easier to write when you're outside of these countries, the truth. And I hope Red Sands is honest. I mean, it's not a gushing book. I do talk about how frustrating it is to be in a city like Dushanbe in Tajikistan and see incredible Soviet buildings ripped down and these Potemkin facades put up and money laundering and traditional bazaars being pulled down. And I talk about this a bit in Uzbekistan as well. So yes, obviously it's easier for me than it is for a local person to say such things.
I have a question here from Paulina Shepherd, and she says, did you witness any of the tradition of music playing during meals? I know that is very much present in Georgia and experienced that myself, but not in Kazakhstan, and I don't know about the other countries.
I have, but I have to admit only in quite a touristy scenario, I think. I'm casting my mind back. So in Bukhara, for example, I remember being in a very touristy restaurant one evening and there being a sort of show, which I don't hugely enjoy. I'm a ginormous world music fan. So anything to do with music, I'm really, really interested in. But I don't know, a lot of the best music I hear in Central Asia is in taxis, playing on the radio. And then, you know, there's that app Shazam where you can try and it tells you what's playing. I'm often doing that. But live music, I mean, people are wonderfully musical. Samarkand in particular, at the Registan, there's a little workshop where you can go and a man demonstrates all the different stringed instruments, for example. But this, again, is a sort of show for tourists. You've just reminded me, yes, of course. The Tajiks. We shouldn't really make generalizations. The Tajiks are incredibly musical and poetic. And I was in the Gam Valley staying with a man, and he literally serenaded me in the evening with sort of Persian-style poetry and a lute after dinner, and it was the most natural thing. It sounds like it could be a bit awkward, but it wasn't. He wanted to play this song, and it was absolutely beautiful. I think Tajikistan actually is possibly the most interesting. in terms of impromptu, natural music. Kazakhs and Kyrgyz also have wonderful stringed instrument music, but I think for people bursting into song, I think, yeah, Tajikistan.
The cultural identity of Tajikistan actually is quite different to the other countries in the region, because it connects itself in identity much more with Persia than with the sort of the Turkic identity that the Northern Central Asian states have. Do you think that's reflected in the food as well, or is there a less clear-cut division of the food?
It's a good question. Tajikistan is kurutob, the salad. They make a very good salad. It's quite difficult to explain. It probably won't sound tasty the way I'll explain it, but it is. It's served in a ginormous wooden platter, and there is something quite Persian about it. It focuses a lot on good tomatoes, good cucumber, quite heavily seasoned, and then kurut, the dried curd milk balls, are watered down and used as a dressing. And this is often served with a ginormous flatbread, not non-bread, a huge flatbread, almost the size of a dinner table, and a lot of fresh fruit on the table. But again, this is Uzbek. We have to remember that Samarkand and Bukhara have extremely large populations of Tajiks. So the crossover is huge. The Persian influence, you also see it with the use of barberries and plov, but again, this is Uzbek and Tajik. So the answer really is, I don't think so.
No, it's just an interesting thing to think about, because language does not necessarily, a division in language does not necessarily translate into a division in other aspects of culture. And there is a huge amount of shared history going back thousands of years, and then obviously more recently in terms of the Soviet, the creation of a Soviet identity supplanting earlier regional identities. We have a question here from Alison, and she says, how do you research where to go or who to meet, or do you see what you come across?
Thanks, Alison. Yeah, so definitely a bit of both. I should say that my husband is also someone who's very interested in Central Asia and worked as a journalist for many years in Almaty and Moscow, and loves Central Asia like I do. So between the two of us, we have quite a good contact network. I'm more interested in the cultural side of things, not just food, art, fashion, music, anything sort of cultural. And James is really interested in the more gritty stuff, so oil, gas, business, politics. So between us, we have a network of friends that we've developed over the years. But really, I do a lot of research in libraries and online. And for example, Becca Atta, who we started talking about at the beginning, when I heard about these underground mosques, because I knew Kazakhstan a bit. I'd been to the north, and I'd been to the new capital, Nur Sultan, and I spent quite a lot of time in Almaty, but I've never been to the west. And the west is so different, and it's like another country. So I knew I wanted to go there. Pavlodar in northern Kazakhstan, James, my husband, said, go see how Siberian it is. It's like being in Siberia. And you got there, and there's not anything really Central Asian there. A yurt cafe looks really out of place because the people it's very heavily Slavic. Russian still mainly spoken, not Kazakh. There's a Chekhov theatre, Winter Cherries Cafe. It's very, very Russian. And I found the most amazing cake shop, which I write about in the book. And I didn't need to force this. I could not believe how phenomenal this cake shop that we found was. James was with me at this point. We went in, and it was like the Fortnum and Masons of Central Asia. They had everything. They had Georgian cha-cha, and they had chocolate fountains, incredible cakes. So you find surprises. The surprises are always the most fun.
The peach cake, which is in Red Sands, which I think is one of your recipes from northern Kazakhstan, is one of my favourite recipes in the book. And I didn't have a great success making it, but that was purely down to my lack of baking prowess rather than the recipe. But I did thoroughly enjoy eating it. And we did it with the Great Central Asian Bake Off competition in the autumn. And there was some spectacular attempts, and people seemed to thoroughly enjoy eating it, but also reading about it and learning about the background to the recipe.
I mean, no one writes about Pavlodar. It's a very, very, very under-visited place. It's pretty interesting. It's on the Irtysh River. Amazing boulevard, really old housing, Russian style, you know, Izba log houses. It's really interesting. But you've got to be, I mean, you need to have an interest, probably. It's a long way to go. But I like to go to places that not everybody goes to, see the other side.
There's a question here from Victoria. She says, how has the book been received in the region and by individual states? And I'd like to sort of add something to that and ask whether it is available locally and whether it is available or going to be available in Russian, which is the lingua franca for the region.
Difficult questions. Yes, it's going to be available in Russian. I have a Russian publisher who published Black Sea. They're called Eskimo. They're a big Russian publisher based in Moscow. So great, there's a Russian edition. There's a Russian edition of Samarkand as well. How's it been received? Well, I don't think many people have seen it, which is hugely frustrating. I have a ton of copies behind me, which are going to fill the suitcase, and I will take them to all of my friends and people who featured in the book. Some guides that I know, I've sent PDF copies to, and people are incredibly generous and very, you know, very nice. And I'm not sure they would criticize it to me. I hope it's been well received. Quite a lot of people in the Foreign Office and ambassadors have all enjoyed it, and I'd like to see it in embassies as a way of putting it out there a bit more. Sophie and I were saying the other day, it's quite frustrating that there aren't very many bookshops in Central Asia with English language books. Some of the big smart 5-star hotels, of which there are only a handful, have the possibility of selling books, but it's a tricky one. I've been interviewed by some regional newspapers, which was good, in Kazakhstan. Haven't done very much with Uzbekistan, and some online. I'm doing an interview for a Russian newspaper tomorrow, and a Moscow Times. So yeah, it's been pretty good.
Annie Freud asks, did you visit and meet with farmers?
Farmers, yes. I'm just trying to think. So the man I mentioned earlier on in Tajikistan was not really a farmer. He ran an orchard. He runs an orchard, and he grafts incredible varieties. I'm trying to find you a picture. He was very interesting. I suppose the farmers I went in search of, again, more harvesters than farmers, were in the walnut forests in Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan's got the biggest walnut forests in the world, apparently. I have no reason to think it's not true. It's quite hard to clarify. Thousands of hectares. Nobody knows quite how large these are. And there's quite a sad story, really. I went because I'd been before, but I haven't been there for harvest. The harvest starts on October the 1st. A couple of animals are slaughtered in the forests, and then people try and harvest as many walnuts as they possibly can. They sell for, I think it's $3 a kilo, and then that triples once they're sold overseas to countries like Iran and Turkey. There hasn't been a good harvest in those walnut forests for 10 years. So a few travel articles have kind of talked it up and said, oh, it's a real carnival atmosphere, and you go there and people are, you know, having a jamboree in the forest and bonfires. And when I went, it was actually really depressing. People said the climate has changed, and illegal logging has really had a negative effect. And I write about this honestly in the book and say that it's not what it used to be, unfortunately, and these incredible forests are changing. So they were very interesting. One man had been there since 1963, every year, and he said he hadn't seen a really good harvest until 2002. Farmers always have things to say. It's always a very interesting way to understand somewhere, and are really quite on the front line of the climate crisis.
Do you think Tajikistan is considered to be one of the world's worst affected countries by climate change. Do you think climate change in the region is going to impact on the kind of products that are grown and therefore the kind of products that people eat?
Well, so the walnuts was one story. In Tajikistan, the apple farmer that I was speaking to, Mirzo Shah, he also swore that there had been significant changes. And these, you know, this is a very, very mountainous country. And if the snow melt changes, it's very, very, very dangerous and very, very negative for a country like Tajikistan. And there's no backup. You know, when people had the civil war after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s in Tajikistan, people were literally living on mulberry flour in the Pamirs. This is really like frontline poverty in lots of these villages, and it's critical that climate stabilised, and they know what's happening. It is changing.
I have one last question. It doesn't say who has asked it, but the question is, what is going to be next for you after Red Sands? Will you be demystifying another part of the world?
Oh, I wish I could demystify places really effectively. It's quite difficult. I'm not sure. It's so difficult at the moment with the way travel is to try and plan. And when I research these books, Black Sea and Red Sands, I really like to entrench myself for some time. So I don't sort of fly in and stay for a couple of weeks. I spent 6 months in the region researching Red Sands. I think you have to spend that kind of time if you're going to write about somewhere in detail. So it really does depend on the situation and where, but let's just say it will be in the former Soviet Union because that's the area of my interest.
Fantastic. I think we're running up to the end of our time, unfortunately, and probably ought to end. I want to say a huge thank you to you for getting me so excited from the comfort of my living room about Central Asia, because it is a place that I love and have a great deal of affection for and many happy memories of. And speaking to you this evening makes me realise how much more there is to see, how much more I want to eat. And yeah, it gives me something to look forward to when I next go back. Thank you also to everybody who's joined us in the audience this evening for your very thought-provoking questions and engagement. Please do join Shute Festival for its events in the same time next Thursday, when nature photographer Hugo Ritson-Thomas will be in conversation with botanist and former director of Kew, Sir Gillian Prance, on biodiversity and wildflower meadows. If you've got any additional questions, I'm sure you can email Caroline. You can certainly email me, and Shute Festival will be able to provide you with our contact details. I think Sam has also put a couple of links, including to Caroline's website, in the chat box, so you can find our contact details there. I wish you all a good evening, and I hope to see you in Central Asia, or at least cooking and eating Central Asian food from Caroline's book very soon indeed.
Thank you, Sophie.